Hello everyone, thank you for joining us. Today we'd like to present Hyper-V on Nutanix. This is the first of many webinars that API Systems Inc. will be performing around the Nutanix hyperconverged platform. Today we've got an expert on hand to walk through us the installation and configuration of Hyper-V on the Nutanix hyperconverged platform.
Thanks, Mark. We're going to go over the agenda right now. Before we get too far into it,
a couple introductions. So hello everyone, my name is Mark Knouse. I'm the CTO here at API Systems Inc. I'm part of the inaugural class of 2014 for the Nutanix Technology Champion, NTC for short. It's been a lot of fun so far, a part of the program. We get access to some early bits from Nutanix. We take part in roadmap discussions, and it's just great to be part of the community. In addition to that, I'm also a Nutanix platform professional. We were one of the first partners to really adopt that and adapt to it. We have several MPPs here at API. I think we're up to, what was it, 6 or 7, Stephen?
I think 7.
Yeah. And you can find me on Twitter at ShaneTech. I tweet mostly about technology items. So Stephen, why don't you tell us a little bit about you?
Hi everybody, my name is Stephen Stetler. I'm a virtualization architect here at API Systems. I have several certifications, but the most important ones that apply to this particular webinar are my experience MCSE Server Infrastructure, which is Windows Server 2012, and MCSE Private Cloud, which is Microsoft System Center 2012. These products are used together with the Nutanix platform to create this new Hyper-V environment that we're going to talk about. Like Mark said, I'm also a Nutanix platform professional, NPP. And, but more importantly, I've been working with Mark now for about 8 years, and his wisdom and guidance has driven me towards the Nutanix platform. But as soon as I was made aware of it, I became very, very excited to learn more. And every moment I get to use Nutanix or deploy Nutanix in the field, my excitement builds, and my enthusiasm hopefully is infectious to the rest of the team, because I truly am a believer in the platform. It's a very exciting time for my career. Over the last 3 years, I think we've been working with it.
Yeah, 3 years now. I agree, Stephen. It's been fun to watch this company just explode, who had an idea in 2011 and really wanted to do things differently. And they were doing what a lot of us were thinking. And although they started off with test, dev, and VDI environments, it really has transcended into a complete data center solution that you can host just about every workload on. And we hear things daily that there's yet another workload that's been migrated. And one or two in particular are the Microsoft workloads, which is why we're so excited about the Windows Server 2012 R2 Hyper-V on the Nutanix platform. So let's go to the next slide. Before we get started, a couple disclaimers. We are a Nutanix partner. However, we also recommend that you go and download the manuals yourself. We have fact-checked a lot of the data in these slides. However, please make sure that you read the manual, and feel free to ask us questions during the webinar here. So with that, Stephen, getting started, do you have what it takes?
At first, the first time I did it, I certainly don't think I did. And I want to say it's a very simplistic procedure to do this. It really is. But there are some roadblocks you could encounter if you've never done it before, or if you haven't been trained. So we're going to go over those in detail. Like Mark said, everything that's presented here was fact-checked. But that said, Nutanix moves at the speed of light. They literally could be releasing something this second contradicting something in these slides.
Great
and the
point.
longer that it's been since we recorded this, obviously, the greater the chance that is. Let's talk about a couple requirements up front. Before you get started, make sure your Nutanix hardware has the capacity. We're going to talk about how to check for capacity. We're also going to talk about the types of Windows Server 2012 R2 installations that are supported. True, we are talking about Hyper-V, and if you've never installed Hyper-V before, or this is all new to you, Hyper-V is simply a role in Windows Server 2012 R2. That said, there is standalone Hyper-V server, but at the end of the day, we don't really get too concerned about the hypervisor. We're really more concerned about the virtual machines being licensed. So knowing which version you're installing is really critical. So there are a couple of methods we'll talk about to get the correct installation of Windows Server 2012 R2. And let's also not forget that to manage Hyper-V, we need System Center Virtual Machine Manager 2012 R2. That is an absolute requirement. And we'll find out real soon that it becomes a chicken or the egg problem if you've never had a Server 2012 R2 VM set up with VMM installed. How will you get this new environment stood up? So make sure you have that as well. We are fortunate as partners to Nutanix that we have direct access to the Nutanix support portal. But I think all customers
would have that. And it's really important as a new customer to familiarize yourself with the Nutanix support portal. As Steven said, they're upgrading it all the time. A lot of great information such as installation overviews, advisories. So really get familiar with that portal. Not that you're going to live in it, because you most likely won't, because the platform is so stable. However, there is a lot of good information in that portal.
One of the great things about this portal, now while I've seen online documentation before, I've never seen it the way that it's done on Nutanix's support portal, where you can go in and search for a document, and it is almost a living document that at any point can be exported as PDF. Well, that's not new. You've probably run into that before. But things can be updated very quickly because it has that ability where you could go in, drill down to a certain topic, go back out, and then see a whole new section. So it is almost like a living document. There's two particular documents, though, that when you log on, you really should search for. And that is the Field Installation Guide and the Hyper-V Administration Guide. These guides offer a lot of technical advice. They help you get in the right direction, but then they also have a lot of factual knowledge, too. So it really is the perfect way to get just the right amount of information. Well, there's nothing that we're covering here that couldn't be found in any of those documents, don't get me wrong. But what we're trying to do is provide it to you in a way that is very direct with screenshots and also in the field experience.
Yeah, and for those of you who may be new to the Nutanix platform, definitely go out and download the Nutanix Bible. It's a very well-written document and has a lot of technical information written very well. So definitely remember that, the Nutanix Bible.
And lastly, you'll want to get an Excel spreadsheet together that will list all the information up front of what it is that you're putting together, from the BMC, your IPMI interfaces, what are those IP addresses, what are your host names for that. Get all this filled out, also the controller VMs and the hypervisor IP. Get that all figured out up front because it will make your work a lot easier. Now, probably a lot of people have done that before. This is not something that's specific to Hyper-V, but it's good to do. So the first thing that you're going to download, this is not something Nutanix will provide for you. It's your licensed Windows Server 2012 R2 ISO.
But Steven, I received this box from CDW. Shouldn't that be enough?
Probably not.
Okay.
First of all, we have to find out if it's a volume license. If it's not a volume license, how many CPUs are you really licensed for? But I'll get to that in just a minute.
Cool.
So there are specific files that are available, be it through MSDN or TechNet or your enterprise license agreement. Once you've downloaded any one of these ISOs listed here, you want to check the hash on the ISO to make sure it matches these values that are listed here. If it doesn't, you're not going to be able to image your Nutanix nodes with it.
Did you run into that problem?
I did.
Yeah.
I did. I got some way through imaging, and the controller VM would not install because it wasn't a supported ISO. This may not be a technical limitation, more of just a fail-safe they put in there because they never got to test that ISO. But actually, you'd be very surprised how many different versions of Windows Server 2012 R2 ISOs are out there.
Right.
On our own, internal file share, there's 4 different versions, and none of them have this right hash. I had to go back to the guy who has the TechNet ID and pull down the correct one.
Interesting.
Yeah. So that's why I put in there, it may be challenging, even if you do have the TechNet. So we used, there's a module in PowerShell called PSCX, and I detailed that in the blog post for this.
Cool.
That I did in 2013, I believe, that talks about how to check the hash. There's another key thing, and that's we talked about capacity. And when I say capacity, I'm not talking about CPU or memory or even the SSDs and HDDs that are attached to your Nutanix nodes. It's probably something you never even thought of. It's called the SATA DOM card, and it's directly on the motherboard itself. You'll want to check to make sure that your SATA DOM has 64 gigabytes of space. And the reason I bring this up is because unlike ESXi or KVM, which maybe install in the hundreds of megs, the Hyper-V installation is the full-blown Windows Server 2012 R2 installation disk. So it is greater than a few hundred megs. Actually, it's in the gigabytes, right? So you're going to want to make sure you have plenty of space not only for a Windows Server installation, but also Windows Update, because those are going to come down to, and it's certainly a lot of disk space that you would never have had to think about for a hypervisor before, whether it's VMware vSphere with ESXi, KVM, or Zen Server. These are things you never thought of. There are very simple ways to check right off the bat. If you have 2000 or 3000 series, they're not supported. But if it's a 1050, an NX 3050, or a 3060, you could have either a 16 gigabyte or 64 gigabyte. It really depends whatever they released it with. Like I said, it wasn't an issue until Hyper-V support came into the picture. Nutanix does have an article here. I'm going to click it for you, bring it up.
Yeah, and this is a lot like our hardware compatibility. You always want to go check the site for the latest and greatest. There's the SATA DOM. Yep.
Right. You can see it slides right on there. Now that is a 4 gigabyte SATA DOM. But up here, scroll up a little. Sorry, Jen. You can see it actually screwed into the motherboard.
Oh.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you just pulled the if you pulled the node out of the block, you wouldn't even notice it because your eyes would be fixated on other things. Very small. So you can look at the actual hardware itself, or you could go back, minimize this, and run any of these commands. So question, and I'll ask Mark because he's the NTC in the room. What do Nutanix blocks ship with? Which hypervisor?
KVM.
That's right. It used to be that, this is going way back, you could order Nutanix blocks with any flavor of hypervisor they had available, and they stopped that, which makes sense because that could delay the shipping process. If you follow the procedures we're outlining here, you could image it yourself much faster because you will have all the media at your disposal. You'll just need to rack it and deploy. So if it's shipped with KVM, you're probably just going to want to go on there and run the fdisk command. But, let's be honest here. If you're receiving a Nutanix block today, it's going to be at least 64 gigabyte SATA DOM, right? So it's probably not an issue. So this is for people with existing Nutanix blocks that have had them around for a while. We have in our lab one such example, an NX 3050, and it has ESXi running on it. So I ran that command, and there it is. I highlighted it in yellow, 16 gigabyte. So guess what, guys? I can't install Hyper-V on it unless I upgrade SATA DOM. Right? Let's get back to your question before, Mark. Yes, licensing. It can be so confusing. Mark, what's your joke about Microsoft licensing?
I don't remember. I have so many.
It really is. It could be its own subset of IT skills, I think.
Oh, yeah.
You could go to college for it. This is really simple. It really doesn't matter what hypervisor you have installed. If you're running Windows Server 2012 R2 VMs, you're paying per physical CPU. Okay. So when I think of deploying virtual machines and I think of using Hyper-V, I really ask myself, how many virtual machines am I deploying?
Right.
And chances are it's more than 2. You didn't buy a Nutanix block because you were going to run 2 VMs on each node. Maybe you did. I don't know. Maybe there's some huge database SQL thing going on, and you got 64 gigs of memory per VM. I don't know. That's not likely the scenario for you. Plus, you're going to have failover, and there's a chance one of the nodes may fail. Not likely, but you always want that +1 architecture. So you're going to go over 2 virtual machines pretty quickly.
Yeah.
There's really only one choice. It's data center. Forget about Hyper-V, because you can install Hyper-V free. You still need to be concerned about, are your VMs licensed? So in the end, you're probably just going to buy data center, which obviously is a lot more money than standard. Now, I know 2008 R2 used to have some addition between data center and standard, allowing you to run somewhere between 2 and unlimited, but those aren't the options anymore. And I don't know what Server 2016 will bring. And
it'll probably change once again.
So always take the time to read about it, even if it's boring, because it is. But knowing about it will give you peace of mind.
Yeah, and my advice to folks out there is definitely engage Microsoft. They have licensing specialists. It is a moving target. It always changes, even within the same version. So don't try to memorize it and learn. I would definitely recommend contacting a licensing specialist. And they make it pretty easy nowadays, Twitter, chat windows, etc. So definitely remember that.
The second thing you're going to download is Foundation. Now, Foundation is the virtual appliance for deploying, I know I put here Hyper-V or ESXi. You could also deploy Acropolis from it too.
Right.
KVM, any supported hypervisor you can deploy with this virtual appliance. You supply the hypervisor. That's the key thing here. Because anything that they're not going to license on your behalf, you have to bring to the party, right? So when you go to the downloads section of the Nutanix support portal, you'll see a drop-down in the drop-down Foundation. Click that, and then from there, you're going to see the versions in the upper right-hand corner. Now, I filtered for the most recent version, 2.1, and I think you should too. You're going to need to download the bottom one, which is why I highlighted it, because that's the actual OVF. And for people that are new to that format, that's the open virtualization format that can be accepted by any hypervisor. Of course, you're going to want to make sure that the hardware supports it. But in this case, there's at least 2 hypervisors that I can vouch that support it. And that's Oracle VirtualBox, and not documented, and something I'm going to show you soon, is it running on a vSphere instance. So you download the first thing, which is the OVF file, and then you import it to the hypervisor. And then you can download the tarball, which is the option above it, the tar.gz, and I just download it directly to the VM, the virtual appliance, and install directly on there. The reason that we image our nodes with Foundation is because it's purpose-built. It's an uncomplicated deployment tool specifically for Nutanix, built by Nutanix. It's a single pane of glass for configuring everything we care about. The IPMI, which is the DMC, right? The hypervisor, you're going to need initial configuration settings on that, which is going to include your IP addresses, right? And you're also going to want to make sure you're deploying the right version of NOS, Nutanix OS. Lastly, there's actually an option to configure the cluster. So all these things can be done when you click Go after filling out the information. And it's pretty fast, too. Nutanix claims that up to 20 nodes can be imaged and then clustered together in about 45 minutes, which is super fast.
Wow.
That's actually improved markedly from when Foundation 1.2 initially came out, which is the first version that I used. And not to say that was slow, because it was fast. But they continually improve. And this is what I was saying before. the rate that Nutanix operates is anything unlike anything I've ever seen.
So, Stephen, I do have a question. You keep mentioning back when you did it. I'm sure you had problems, and let's be clear. Every technical platform is going to have its share of issues and idiosyncrasies. But what was it like to deal with Nutanix support when you did have to?
Well, first of all, it was so easy because when I get the alert, Nutanix support is also getting the alert.
No, excellent.
So when I call up or I create an incident, they're already 2 steps ahead of me. They've seen the problem. They've got the right engineer assigned to it, who's knowledgeable, who's very educated, and has a positive attitude, which is something I really appreciate.
Hold on. So what are you trying to say? Knowledgeable, very educated, other companies don't have this?
Well, I'm sure other companies do have this, but this is such a direct line to me.
What do you feel that made these support professionals different?
Definitely how trained they were.
Right.
I've never seen anything like it. They're all so passionate about this technology. They believe in it, and they live and breathe it.
Yeah, and through the course of a couple problems and issues that we worked through, what we found was there was holistic knowledge within the support engineers and the operations folks, meaning they just didn't say, that's not a Nutanix problem, thank you, call the other vendor. They really worked with us through it end to end to see the problem resolved. So thank you very much to that individual. However, we've encountered that with everyone that we've worked with on the operations side at Nutanix.
It is fair to say that obviously they take on things that would normally be out of the scope of other companies. They would consider it out of the scope of support. When I had issues with Hyper-V, they were very much involved in supporting Hyper-V. At no point did they redirect me to Microsoft support. So kudos to them for being so passionate. When they say they support Hyper-V on their platform, do they mean it? Right?
Yeah, and they didn't overstep, but they gave guidance. And where areas that may have been Microsoft, we did our due diligence and contacted Microsoft. Never once did we assume that Nutanix was our Microsoft support entity, but it was just that very personal touch, customer-focused support that allowed us to ask the right questions to Microsoft. So back to you, Steve. I didn't mean to interrupt you on the support, but I think that's an important point to mention.
Yeah. And we may revisit that later, actually.
Oh, okay, cool.
Imaging nodes can also be accomplished directly through the IPMI. So anybody who's had, let's say, an HP or a Dell with DRAC, they know they can load an ISO into the DRAC or the ILO and use virtual media that way to install. And Nutanix is no different, but I highly advise against it. I would use that for your clutch situations where a node has so badly failed and you need to reinstall Hyper-V. Well, that's an individual one-off. Then you don't use Foundation for that. So that's the exception, not the rule. Like we said earlier, Nutanix ships hardware with KVM and Nutanix OS already installed. So if you want to use ESXi or Hyper-V, you have to use Foundation to create your cluster. I think I covered these other points. Just in case you're not clear, NOS and Phoenix are the same. So the next thing you're going to do is download Phoenix, which is the controller VM software. And that is also available on the Nutanix support portal. When you click the Downloads dropdown, you should see Phoenix there. I highlighted Hyper-V in the upper right-hand corner because it's important that you get the correct controller VM software for the hypervisor you're installing. It's true that Nutanix is hypervisor agnostic, but the controller VM is software that is hypervisor purposed, is specific. So make sure you select the right version.
So that's how the controller gets there,
right?
Through Phoenix.
Yeah, Phoenix is just the conduit. One question you may need to answer, you may have the answer to, is if the Nutanix block that you have in your possession is already in a cluster configuration or not. Right? If it's shipped straight from factory, it's not yet in a cluster configuration. If you were going to go with KVM as your hypervisor, you could skip this whole foundation and ISO business, and you would boot it up, and you would do a discovery through Bonjour, which is a software that Apple created, and you would automatically run discovery through IPv6, and it would create the cluster. You can name things and set IP addresses.
So we do have customers that may be early adopters and went with ESX at first, who are looking to migrate to Hyper-V. They would definitely, obviously, follow your recommendations.
They're gonna fit under this exception here. They're gonna have to destroy the cluster.
Right.
And you know, I do have the command here. It's fairly straightforward: cluster destroy. What you're really gonna do is cluster stop first, and then a cluster destroy. But before any of those commands are run, geez, back up your VMs and data, right? Shouldn't have to say that, but I should also make a point to harp on how important that is. Back up, back up, back up. Gearing up to deployment. This is my pun, laying the foundation. So I thought it was funny. I tried to do this, and Nutanix advised me against it, but I can be stubborn. I tried to do the imaging off-site. Right? I tried to do it at our API office, and I just had to redo it when I got to the client side anyway. Because it's going to want to connect to everything during the imaging process. What I'll show you is when you're going through Foundation, it's going to ask you what is the DNS server IP address.
Oh, so you tried to stage the customer's block
right
here prior to the customer environment.
I thought I was so clever.
There was just too many underpinnings.
The thing is that Foundation is so fast, and it really does do everything for you. So it kind of needs everything to connect to do it all for you.
Right.
So my recommendation is don't be stubborn like me. Rack it at the client or customer site, or if you are an internal employee, simply rack it yourself in the data center that it's going to be in, right? And begin cabling. And I say here, just cable your 10 gig and your IPMI port, but there's exceptions to that. Dell is now a Nutanix provider, and I think for Dell you have to have the DRAC and the one of the 1 gigabit ports plugged in. Now, don't get me wrong, you can definitely do this with the 1 gigabit port plugged in. You're just going to run into issues later on down the road when you're setting up the Hyper-V cluster, completely independent of Nutanix, right? It has nothing to do with it, because Hyper-V cluster is a Windows failover cluster. It's just more simplified if you have the 10 gigabit ports plugged in. It knows what to set up the load balance switch, right? So even though we're not using the IPMI to load the virtual media and install, this is how Foundation is providing the installation of Phoenix, right? And the hypervisor for that matter. But what it's not doing is loading the virtual media directly into the IPMI. What's happening is it's streaming it directly through. So we're going to get into this in a little bit, but just know that that connection is very critical. The 10 gig are also important, but it's going through the IPMI. Another thing you're going to want to do, this is not something that needs to be done at this point while you're racking, but prior to running Foundation, do yourself a favor. Disable STP on the switch that's running or that has plugged in the 10 gigabit ports and all that. And there's a reason for that. Both the 1 gig and the 10 gig, right? Because STP can potentially cause a timeout in Foundation. And that's something that Nutanix specifically spells out in their field advisory guide. Now, I've never ran into it because I took their word for it. I didn't want to run into it, right? I just wanted it to run smoothly.
So the STP recommendation is something coming from the Nutanix guide. However, what about the next one? Is that more Nutanix or Microsoft?
That is completely Microsoft. Jumbo frame support is something that's required for failover clustering of Hyper-V servers. But I figure since you're going to be on the switch, you might as well make both changes at once, right?
Do that one.
Okay. So Nutanix's field guide suggests you use VirtualBox, and that means that you would load it on your laptop, and you would.
Now they suggest, or is it you must?
They just don't have instructions for anything else.
Okay.
Yeah. And I generally don't like type 2 hypervisors. But their recommendation is, or I'm sorry, I shouldn't use the word recommendation. Their instructions are to set up Oracle VirtualBox, and they have a litany of instructions on how to best do that. And I ran into all kinds of challenges with my laptop not having a NIC, right? It has this little dongle here and bridging the adapters. What a pain. So I didn't want to deal with that, so I just simply loaded it in VMware ESX as a OVF import. It imported right away. And as I note here, the virtual disk isn't using the .vdi format that Oracle VirtualBox does, so it kind of makes me think at some point they were using VMware, unless they specifically created CMDK. I don't know. But it imports no problem. And I use the procedure that VMware has detailed for installing VMware tools, and I was good to go. But that said, you probably want to follow what's in the instructions. And it's a very simple thing because Oracle VirtualBox is free.
And we may or may not have an existing virtualization environment to do this.
Right. And if you're a Microsoft shop, the last thing you want to hear from somebody talking about Hyper-V is
install ESX.
Right.
So I love that last bullet, because if you are at the customer site or the customer himself is doing this, you're going to want to have the right machine to do it. You mentioned avoiding the dongle-oriented NIC and wireless. Any other recommendations? You need a pretty beefy workstation, it would seem.
I tell you, the CPU and the memory did not spike as much as I anticipated, but the disk I/O was massive. Because in this case, when I was running, it's not just that you're reading a stream out to your IPMI. You're creating specific packages using the ISO and some dummy automation scripts, for this node gets this IP address, and this node gets that IP address, right? And all that information. So there's a lot of writing and reading going on while this is happening.
Is that documented anywhere, the system requirements for Foundation?
Only that you have a minimum of 25 gigabytes free, and you
Capacity.
should, yes, and you should use an SSD.
Okay. I could see why with all the reads and writes, you're going to need something to get the data on the wire. Just from our side, having done this, Type 2 virtualization, like Stephen said, does have its own challenges. Don't try to do it within a VM already running somewhere. You definitely want to get closest to the metal as possible on your laptop or desktop. Disable any unneeded services. Watch the virus scan. Your very generic recommendations. Most importantly, a wired NIC would be a strong recommendation. Avoid the dongles and of course, a slow wireless connection.
Now, when I wrote a blog about this, going on 2 years ago, it was an earlier version of Foundation 2.0, and this is getting back to what I was saying about the dummy automation scripts it creates. Luckily, it doesn't do this anymore. It doesn't create an ISO copy for each node. And with Windows Server 2012, our 2 ISO being 4 gigabytes, you can see how quickly you'd run out of disk space. They did two things. The first thing they did is they now share that 1 ISO, so it's much more efficient from a CPU perspective and a disk perspective. But also, it's much, much faster for imaging. So it's good to know that you don't have to go through any extra steps to expand or provide an extent to the Linux VM's virtual disk. This is just me being the architect that I am. Go in there with a plan, right? Make sure everything has been filled out. Make sure, if you're a consultant, that all the DNS entries have been created and the IP addresses are still available prior to doing this. It just works better. Something that is required, that is not required for other deployments, like I said, VMware ESXi, is an external IP address and host record for that external IP address. And the reason for that is going to be your Hyper-V cluster failover name. Right? So if anybody who's done Windows Server failover clustering knows you need that external name.
So a little bit of time. Yeah, excuse me. A little bit of time could really make up for a lot of pain later. Take this form seriously. Make sure you have all your names, your IP addresses. You don't want to be thinking about these A records or an IP you need while you're sitting at the console doing it. So document all this up front and you'll save yourself some pain.
Consider that an SMB share typically works off a host name or an FQDN. It's not working off an IP address. It's not how we normally operate in the Windows world. Having those DNS entries in ahead of time will make your life a lot easier. Now I'm going to show you pretty much what it's like starting up the Foundation VM.
Good luck, Stephen.
We're all counting on you. Right. Okay, guys. Going to bring this up. Hope you like my car. That's not really my car. I want this. Okay. I had myself logged in, but I talked too long, so I got logged out.
I don't think our vCenter is running on Nutanix.
It's probably not.
In fact, definitely not. It's on our infrastructure clusters.
It was faster with 5.5, the vSphere Web Client. Once it got upgraded to 6.0, what a difference in speed. And you know, it's funny because I would hear people do a comparison between vSphere versus SCVMM versus Machine Manager, and they say, hey, you know, VMM is so slow. I can't use it. It's a pain. Well, I think vSphere Web Client might be getting up there. Okay, so VMs and templates. The reason that I have this powered off right now is because I wanted to make sure that prior to powering it on, that STP was disabled on the switches, right? And you're going to want to do the same thing. Okay, so this looks just like a regular CentOS VM. The password is that standard controller VM password. Now when you log in, maybe one of the first things you want to do is just check the IP address, which on Linux is this config. So I have the IP address here. If not, you could use the set foundation IP address, and this will allow you to configure it if you have not already configured it. Pretty easy. On the desktop of the Foundation VM is a shortcut for Firefox, bookmark in this case. That is your first page for filling out the imaging process. Now, one of the great things about having this hosted somewhere else is I can just go over here and bring up, right here. Where is my mouse? There it is. Sorry, guys. I said there's a bookmark to save myself some time, but in hindsight, I really didn't save much time. Okay. So you saw how quickly that loaded. So I'm just going to fill in some dummy values here for everybody. This is a scenario where our IPMI, our hypervisor, and our controller VMs are all on the same subnet. Probably not your scenario, but if it is, it will still work. You should just keep in mind that if it's a flat switch and you have multiple subnets, you should click multi-homing here. This password, username and password, is the username and password for your IPMI. So if it's an existing block and it's already been purposed for another cluster and you've destroyed the cluster, I would go on to each IPMI and confirm the password is what you're entering here. I think default is admin, right? And the username is capital ADIMIN. Right? It's very case sensitive for the username. Remember what I was telling you about having it racked at the correct data center it's going to be deployed at? Right here, the hypervisor is asking what's the DNS server IP. Right. Lastly, this really should be decided before you start this process. The amount of memory that you attribute to the controller VM really depends on what it is you're doing with your Nutanix cluster, of course. But I certainly would not use less than 24 gigabytes. That would be my starting point. But every controller VM in the cluster has to have the exact same amount of memory assigned. If you have, let's say, a virtual desktop deployment, and you're using a non-persistent image, whether it's Citrix MCS machine creation services or VMware link clones, you will want to give as much memory to the controller VMs as possible to cache master images of non-persistent virtual desktops. That's one example. Another example is a high disk I/O environment where you're constantly writing to disk. I think Nutanix is the example. If all of your disks exceed 20 terabytes, you will want to give more memory, at least 32 gigabytes of memory to the controller VM. New in this Foundation version 2.1 is the option for 64 gigabytes. Before, the absolute maximum was 32. But if you have the memory for it, maybe you want to think about this might be a good starting point if we know we're going to have a lot of high disk I/O and we're using Citrix machine creation services or VMware link clones.
Yeah, that's a great point, Stephen. It's all going to depend what you're doing with your cluster.
So I'm just going to pick 32 for now and click Next. So right now, it's attempting to do a discovery on any unclustered nodes. So, Mark, is it going to find anything?
Should.
Right, because we have a cluster.
if it does, I mean.
If it does, we have a problem. Right? Luckily, you have the option to add blocks manually. You could enter in the IPMI's MAC address if you wanted to, just in case it doesn't discover. But if it's not discovering, you probably have a bigger problem. We can proceed without doing that, and that's probably what we should do at this point. It's interesting that it allows us to proceed, but nonetheless, it's good. So right now, you're probably asking yourself, how am I going to get those ISOs into this Foundation VM? In the case of VirtualBox, if you install Oracle VirtualBox, I think it's VM editions, that's the VMware tools, and it enlightens the VM. You could drag and drop the ISOs. But the great thing about this is it tells you specifically where it's going to be looking for those ISO files. So in the case of the NOS, which we know is Phoenix, go into Nutanix, right, which you should see Nutanix's home, Foundation, and there's an NOS folder here. So here is where I drop the Phoenix ISO, right? And that was told to me right here, Foundation/NOS. Next, Foundation ISOs hypervisor. So if I go to Foundation ISOs hypervisor, Hyper-V, I find my Windows 2012 R2 ISO that has the correct hash. The reason why it's not selectable from this dropdown is because I have to hit this dropdown here for Hyper-V. And now it's automatically there. You won't have to restart this if you have to copy the ISO over again because maybe you copied it to the wrong directory. Just simply click refresh and there you go. Believe it or not, the SKU is important. Make sure you select the one that corresponds to the ISO of Hyper-V. Data center, standard, or free. Click next and you get the optional step to create the cluster from here. The cluster name is going to be what your Windows failover cluster name would be. It's also what Nutanix calls the external name and external IP address. So make sure these things are in DNS ahead of time. Make sure you have this already figured out because you're going to use it in two places. You're going to use it for the SMB share that Nutanix is going to create, and you're also going to use it to connect to the Nutanix cluster. It's an optional step for vSphere deployments, but I still recommend doing it. It's just good to have. So you fill out the name and all that good stuff. Check boxes for diagnostics and NCC. Those are topics that can span 45 minutes on their own, so I'm not going to go into it. But I would check them. Now you could create as many clusters as you want. This is what's so great about this, is that if you had, let's say, 20 nodes and you wanted to do 2 different clusters, you could assign 10 to one and 10 to the other. Right? Over here, you get the option of redundancy factor. That simply is saying that at a minimum, you're going to have data on 2 nodes at any given time, so that if a node fails, there's always another node. And that's your standard minimum of 3 nodes in your cluster. If you choose 3, which means now you have 3 copies of your data dispersed, you will need a minimum of 5 nodes in your cluster. So 1 block will not be enough. And you will need at least 16 gigs of controller VM memory, but that's usually the case anyway. So that is how Foundation works. When you've filled out everything, you simply click Run Installation. Going through this real quick, if you've done this before, this is a very well-documented procedure. You go in and you create your storage pool in your container. You do not mount SMB storage from this console, though. This is something that's done separately. You're going to want to make sure that each IP address of your hypervisors is listed in the file system whitelist, as well as your virtual machine manager server, and any other thing that needs to access that SMB3 share, which is where all of your virtual machine files reside. Before you install VMM, make sure you meet the requirements. It's going to need a Server 2012 R2 instance, and you're going to have to install Windows Deployment Kit for Windows 8.1. Also, not something I mentioned here, but you need a SQL server, because that's the database for VMM. On the VMM server, run the commandlet, set SMB client configuration to not require security signature. And then on the controller VM, they have an automated script that will complete the cluster configuration from a Hyper-V standpoint. That's the failover server. Some recommendations here. This is just my thing, right? Just kind of going off topic a little bit here, but since you're licensed for Operations Manager anyway, because you have System Center, you might as well leverage the management plugins that Nutanix offers for free. So load them on the SCOM, and now you'll get hardware alerts as well as controller VM alerts. Lastly, the SCVMM add-in, which allows you to use the fast cloning commandlets that are available to Hyper-V servers from the SCVMM GUI itself.
So, do we have any questions? I think there were a couple, but great job, Stephen. Excellent to see how Hyper-V actually gets installed on the Nutanix blocks. The automation that Nutanix is baking in and the ease of use is really where we need to go with everything in IT, and it's great to see companies like Nutanix going that route. What was your total learning curve for this Hyper-V on the Nutanix? Because it was very native for us to do ESXi. What would you say your VMware to Hyper-V learning curve was?
The majority of it for me was Virtual Machine Manager.
Oh, okay.
The
not
nuance.
Not so much the switches or the.
No, just knowing those facts and getting around, because the actual imaging process, you could do before someone finishes lunch.
Right.
That's not that big of a deal. The nuances of System Center Virtual Machine Manager are important. That is a whole other topic. Right now, we're just trying to focus on getting Hyper-V on these nodes. You will spend the majority of your time working in Virtual Machine Manager, but hey, that's a good thing. That means the hardware is getting out of the way, just like Nutanix sells us on. They are living up to it.
Right. What were some of the use cases that you used the Hyper-V on Nutanix? Can you go into some of your customer experience?
I think the biggest example were Microsoft shops where they didn't want to go the VMware route, right? If you already have volume license agreements with Microsoft for System Center and Windows Server 2012, that is what you will want.
Oh, excellent. I think we got a question.
Can you use, all right, so the question is, can you use Foundation for building a cluster with Nutanix Community Edition?
That's a great question.
That is a great question. I don't think I have an answer to that. I think, well, actually I do. Isn't it KVM only?
It's yes. Yeah.
Okay. Wondering how they handle supporting different vendors' IPMI solutions. That's a good question, Adam. But Mark can probably get into the process of installing Nutanix Community Edition better than I. But just know that everything's loaded right onto a USB memory stick.
That's correct.
Right, and you need one per physical server that you have.
That's correct. Yeah.
So basically everything's running in memory, of course, but it's all loaded from that memory stick.
Yeah.
So there's really no imaging.
Yeah, Community Edition is real easy, and like Stephen said, you got to start off with the USB stick, and unlike the SATA DOM, it is, I don't want to say hardware agnostic, but there are some hardware considerations you do have to take into account. And to Stephen's point earlier, it's always evolving. So definitely check the Community Edition site regularly, and more importantly, join up to the Nutanix.next community portal. There's a lot of information in there, and a lot of guys spend time just helping out customers and community followers.
Great point. It's a very passionate community.
Yeah, and it's also a lot of fun. For those who like to play with hardware, it's a good waste of an afternoon or a weekend.
So the next question is, I'm not very familiar with the underlying Nutanix storage technology, but I know it does some fancy stuff. Okay. Are there any considerations with Windows file systems and/or backup technologies such as VSS when implementing on Nutanix?
That's a great question.
Let's consider how virtual machines write to their file system. So obviously, a virtual machine, virtual disk, is nothing more than a file. But Nutanix does intercept all the writes and sends them directly to the hot cache on the SSD. So writes are extremely fast because those SSDs are localized. You're not going across some storage fabric to get to some set of disks somewhere, across the network. So I would think that VSS works great, personally. That's my experience. I would think that there's no special fine-tuning you need to do for that. That's my answer to that.
Yeah, your existing backup technologies will work if you have them with Hyper-V today. So I do like the first part of that. Nutanix is doing some fancy stuff. Like I said earlier, if you haven't read the Nutanix Bible, there's a lot of that fancy stuff explained. Stephen pointed to the localization as a very powerful feature of the technology.
Yeah, when people are new to the platform and they're concerned about IOPS, I kind of try not to chuckle, because what do I care if the IOPS are occurring locally on an SSD?
Right.
I don't get too concerned about that. But if you're coming from the traditional SAN-based approach, I could see how this would be enlightening. Got a lot to learn about just how this changes the game. Another question. What would you say the advantages of using Hyper-V with Nutanix over other flavors of hypervisors, such as VMware and Nutanix's own Acropolis?
I'm going to take the consultant answer on that, and it's going to depend. And it's a great question. You really have to look at your organization, what's the current skill sets there, your operational model. Earlier in the hypervisor war, there was a big performance difference and a big difference with the network virtualization stack. However, these hypervisors have matured greatly. So if you're a current Microsoft Hyper-V shop, I would definitely recommend staying that way. If the skill sets are of your operations team are more in line with Microsoft technologies, then learning or adopting a Linux style of operations, meaning your command line and more of your scripting technologies, I may recommend to stay within that Microsoft world. Because Stephen, you could add to this, you did a lot of work with PowerShell when you were enabling this project, and if you're familiar with that, it might be a little easier for you than PowerCLI or even Python and other languages. But again, your mileage is going to vary. It's really going to be driven by some organizational requirements more so than technical.
I mean, I could think of one example where you want to bring up Exchange, and Microsoft will not support Exchange on an NFS share.
That is a great point. Full support for Microsoft Exchange Server.
It's being presented as SMB3, which is supported.
And that may even be the argument for a multi-hypervisor support model as well.
Yeah, keep in mind, you can have a cluster that's KVM Acropolis, and you can have another cluster that's Hyper-V.
Sure.
And then you have Prism Central, which is tying the two together. So it's a unified experience in Prism, which is a topic I didn't even get to discuss today. But yeah, mix and match. You know, use what's best for the deployment scenario, and you don't have to stay with it. But if you're a shop that only does Microsoft, we can accommodate that as well. So, looking to see if I have any other questions here. Maybe we can move on to closing thoughts.
Sure. So thank you, everyone, for listening to us. If you haven't checked out some of the news around Nutanix and what they're doing on the Hyper-V areas, definitely do so. It's definitely an option that you should think about strongly. Again, taking into account organizational factors, operations, etc., but it's something that you shouldn't be afraid of. It's definitely a strong option nowadays, and thanks to Nutanix for supporting Hyper-V and giving up consultants like us more options for our customers.
I agree.
So I would like to thank everyone, and thank you, Stephen. Thank you for sharing all that experience and knowledge.
Thank you for having me, and I really enjoy sharing information and knowledge, but that is part of our culture, so that's what we do.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.